The unspoken room. There are places in this world where truth isn't just hidden, it's punished. In the early hours of March 15, 1889, room 237 of the Belmont Hotel in Newport, Rhode Island, stood frozen in time. Silk curtains still drawn. 2 untouched glasses of Veuve Clicquot resting beside a bottle no one dared to move. A half-written letter lay on the mahogany escritoire, its ink smudged as if the hand that wrote it had vanished mid-thought. No blood, no struggle, no witnesses. Just absence. Isabella Fairmont had vanished, and for over 40 years, that silence would be maintained by force. You were never meant to hear this story, not because it was forgotten, but because those who remembered were paid handsomely to forget. She wasn't just another socialite. She was a symbol of power, of control, of lineage, and of what happens when you try to escape it. Newport in the 1880s wasn't a playground for the rich. It was a fortress. The Gilded Age's elite had turned their wealth into a religion, their estates into temples, and their children into pawns in an unholy game of preservation. Power wasn't inherited, it was curated, cultivated, protected at all costs. So when Isabella, a woman born of old Boston blood and Steel Empire fortune, stepped out of line, even slightly, there were consequences. But what did she see? What did she threaten to expose? And why did her name disappear from official records less than 3 years after her vanishing? You're not just watching a story of a woman who went missing. You're descending into the machinery behind it. Because Isabella Fairmont's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a ritual, a warning, a message to those who, like her, began to wake up inside the illusion. The architecture of control, they called it society. You've heard whispers, but it was more like a script, an intricate theatre where every movement, every smile, every scandal was staged with cold precision. Newport wasn't built for leisure. It was engineered for containment. Behind the Italian marble, the peacock feather fans, the champagne towers, stood an invisible infrastructure designed not to entertain, but to dominate. The mansions were monuments, yes, but also prisons. And Isabella Fairmont, for all her wealth and beauty, was born into a cage made of gold. You see, control isn't always enforced with chains. It's cultivated through expectation. From the moment she was old enough to curtsy, Isabella was indoctrinated, trained to play a role. Her marriage? A merger. Her home? A stage. Her freedom? A performance choreographed by men in dark rooms with clean hands and bloodless intentions. And those men, they didn't wear masks or cloaks. They wore silk cravats and sat on museum boards. Their weapon wasn't a dagger. It was exclusion. And if that failed, it was erasure. But Isabella was different. She began asking the wrong questions. Not just about who was sleeping with whom, but why her family's shipping fortune was quietly subsidizing state infrastructure, and where the paper trail ended. She started tracing donations, property transfers, legal exemptions, and what she found was something most women of her class knew better than to even notice. Because behind the lace and law of Newport was something older, far older. A quiet network of power that traced its fingers not just through wealth, but through ritual. There were patterns in the architecture, symbols hidden in plain sight, a chapel with inverted geometry, a series of mirrors in Rosecliffe Manor reflecting a compass alignment that mimicked a Freemasonic rite. Even the layout of the gardens followed a sacred geometry aligned with lunar phases. Coincidence? That's what they'd want you to think. But Isabella, she stopped believing in coincidence. And when she began to speak, to confide, to write, someone noticed. The invitations slowed, the glances sharpened, and one night her diary, hidden beneath the floorboards of her private study, vanished. She never mentioned it to her husband, but she told him. Jonathan Pembroke, the architect, the one man in Newport who understood how power could be hidden in walls, and when you understand how something is built, you also understand how it can be broken. This was the moment it all began to unravel. And what they did next was not a warning. It was a verdict. The man who wasn't supposed to exist. Every fortress has a flaw, and in Newport, that flaw walked with perfect posture and eyes like storm glass. Jonathan Pembroke. To the public, he was a mere architect, quiet, brilliant, commissioned by the elite to expand their marble fortresses with Roman columns and Grecian symmetry. But those who paid attention, truly paid attention, knew something was off. Pembroke's designs were never just beautiful. They were precise, symbolic. Some whispered he embedded codes into blueprints. Others said he never used a compass. But his buildings always aligned with solstice shadows, with the ancient stars, with things long forgotten by men obsessed with profit. He claimed to study under William Butterfield in England, but no such records exist. His letters of recommendation, forgeries. His birth certificate, gone. Jonathan Pembroke was a man without a past, and that's exactly what drew Isabella to him. Because by 1884, Isabella no longer trusted anyone with a past, especially not the kind written in family Bibles and sealed court documents. She needed someone who didn't belong, someone who could see the system from outside. And he did. Pembroke saw what she was beginning to feel, that Newport was a mask stretched over something older, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. He introduced her to the forgotten architecture of the region, underground tunnels not on city records, sealed chambers beneath the Church of the Holy Cross, a burnt farmhouse outside Portsmouth with markings that predated the Revolution, and he showed her where those markings appeared again inside her own manor. Rosecliffe, her sanctuary, her prison. They began mapping the symbols, comparing names on estate deeds, tracing trust funds back through shell companies until they discovered something no one was meant to find, that the fortunes of 5 of Newport's old est families, including Isabella's own, were connected through a single hidden holding company, Ravenscroft Limited. No public address, no board meetings, no signatures, only seals, red wax, marked with a raven. It was in that moment, somewhere between realization and panic, that Isabella whispered something to Pembroke that would alter everything. What if I was never meant to be free? That question, that one question, was her undoing. Because questions like that don't echo through marble halls, they shatter them. And those who shatter halls in Newport are dealt with quietly. You're beginning to see it, aren't you? This isn't just about a woman who vanished. It's about a system built to erase anyone who remembers too much. Ravenscroft, the company that owned silence. What would you do if you found out your family's fortune came from something they never wanted written down? Isabella Fairmont's inheritance wasn't just blood and land. It was obedience. A centuries-old agreement passed through unspoken rituals and sealed vaults. Never questioned, never documented. And at the core of it all was a name she'd never heard until Pembroke said it aloud, in a whisper like a curse. Ravenscroft. Officially, Ravenscroft Limited didn't exist. No registered offices, no traceable executives. But behind the curtain, it moved billions in assets, dictated land rights, and funded political campaigns under layers of generational trust funds. It was older than the Newport mansions, older than the Constitution. Pembroke suspected it had ties to certain shadow networks in pre-revolutionary Europe, groups who didn't just seek wealth, but continuity of control. Control over land, over inheritance, over memory itself. When Isabella and Pembroke traced the legal origin of her father's shipping empire, they found something deeply disturbing. The Aldridge family had acquired key port territories not through commerce, but through a closed-loop acquisition, funded by Ravenscroft. But here's where it gets darker. In Ravenscroft's hidden ledgers, handwritten, kept in vaults beneath a now-demolished bank in Providence, Pembroke found references to human inventory, status cleared. Dates matched to ships that disappeared mysteriously along the eastern seaboard in the early 1800s. Men, women, children, gone without trace. And Isabella's great-grandfather? He captained one of those ships. The Aldridge wealth wasn't just born from trade. It was born from the unspoken slave routes that operated after abolition. Smuggled souls, erased names. Blood money buried beneath marble floors. This wasn't guilt. This was inheritor. And Ravenscroft's purpose became horrifyingly clear: to maintain the illusion of legitimacy through strategic amnesia. A network of families trained not to remember, but to obey. And when one of their own tried to pull back the veil, she didn't get threats. She got vanished. You see, power doesn't scream. It doesn't punish in public. It erases. And as Isabella drew closer to the core, her letters stopped reaching their recipients. Her newspaper column was suspended. One night, she found her bedroom mirror etched with a message she hadn't written. Say nothing. The raven is watching. That night, she packed a suitcase she never got to carry. This is how real power works. Not with a bang, but with a silence so complete, it rewrites the past. We're not done. You're just starting to feel it. The mirror room and the doctrine of forgetting. Power doesn't just want obedience, it wants amnesia. After the message appeared on Isabella's mirror, say nothing. The raven is watching. She knew she was no longer just unraveling secrets. She was now being observed. Not by gossiping socialites or jealous rivals, but by something colder, older, mechanical in its silence. She became paranoid, yes, but not irrational. The house staff changed overnight. Maids who had worked at Rosecliffe for years were suddenly dismissed for insubordination. Their replacements barely spoke, rarely blinked. They moved through the hallways like ghosts with perfect posture. Then came the dreams. Nightmares of a faceless man in a long coat, of black feathers falling like ash, of an invisible council reciting the same phrase over and over: to forget is to remain. It wasn't just fear. It was indoctrination. Subtle, surgical. The psychological machinery of Erasure working in real time. You've heard of gaslighting, but what Isabella endured was something far more evolved. A ritualized suppression of identity. The method wasn't physical violence, it was psychological disassembly. She began questioning her own memories. She would light a candle and return to find it unburnt. Write a note, and later find it rewritten in her own hand. Pembroke, alarmed, began sleeping in his studio. He believed the house itself, Rosecliffe, had been constructed according to esoteric principles that allowed not just secrecy, but manipulation. Mirrors placed at angles that distorted perception. Rooms with acoustic anomalies that echoed things never spoken aloud. And then they discovered the mirror room. It wasn't on the original blueprints. Hidden behind a false panel in the east wing, accessible only through a passage that required a precise series of movements, a geometric sequence Pembroke called a tool key. Inside, 7 mirrors. Each antique, each imported from estates connected to the original Ravenscroft signatories, and etched at the base of each frame, barely visible under the patina, a Latin phrase repeated again and again: oblivione regnare, to rule by forgetting. This was no parlor. It was a chamber of cognitive warfare. Isabella stood in the center and swore she heard a voice whisper her childhood name. Not her married name, not the one written in newspapers, but the one only her mother had called her in secret. No one had spoken that name in 30 years. You think this is history? No. This is programming. Isabella wasn't losing her mind. She was being unwritten. And you were never meant to know this room existed. The Trial Beneath the Garden. By the summer of 1888, Isabella Fairmont no longer walked her gardens for leisure. She was searching, obsessively, frantically, for the entrance Pembroke insisted existed. An entrance to something beneath Rosecliffe, not metaphor, not legend. A literal chamber buried under the estate, built long before the Fairmonts took possession. Pembroke's research had become feverish. He'd found soil surveys from 1851, strange gaps, inconsistencies in the foundation, and then something else. A single page from an architect's journal, sealed with the raven emblem. It referred cryptically to a substratum ritualis beneath the East Gardens, used in times of crisis to maintain the doctrinal oath of forgetting, and it named 5 women, all socialites, all declared missing between 1783 and 1854, none of them found. That's when Isabella understood. She wasn't the first. She was the next. One night, under moonlight thick as oil, they dug near the old rose trellis. At 3:17 a.m., Pembroke's spade struck iron. A trap door. No lock. Just a recessed plate with the image of a blindfolded raven, and an inscription in Old English. She who sees must kneel, or be unmade. The air beneath reeked of cedar, rust, and old perfume. They descended. What they found was not a cellar. It was a chamber of judgment. Semicircular, carved stone benches on either side. At the far wall, a granite seat raised slightly above the rest, shaped to hold a human form upright, restrained, and facing forward. Above it, chiseled into the stone, "Remembrance is treason." And below the chair, beneath a glass tile, 5 braided locks of hair, preserved, labelled. The last, I.F. Isabella Fairmont. It was already there, as if it had already happened. That moment shattered something in her. And you have to understand, the elite don't punish with fire or gallows. They punish with ritual, with legacy assassination. To vanish from the record is a fate worse than death. It means no memory, no echo, no self. Pembroke wanted to destroy it, burn the chamber, expose it, flee the country. But Isabella, terrified, trembling, told him, "If they did this to the others, it means the system isn't broken. It means it's working perfectly." She left the chamber that night knowing what came next. But what she didn't know was that someone else had followed them down. The trapdoor was left open. By dawn, it was sealed shut again. Only one of them made it out. The disappearance that was scripted in advance. When the Belmont Hotel staff found room 237 empty on the morning of March 15, 1889, they thought it was simply a missed checkout. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no alarm. But they didn't see the ritual. They didn't see the script already unfolding behind velvet curtains and legal titles. You see, Isabella Fairmont's disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't even personal. It was procedural. A sequence, long rehearsed, designed for people like her, those who ask questions not meant to be asked. That week, 3 things happened so quietly, they were almost missed. The police report was filed, then sealed by a judge whose brother sat on the Ravencroft Trust. Rosecliffe Manor was transferred to a private caretaker entity, its staff dismissed with binding non-disclosure agreements. The Newport Daily News, once obsessed with Isabella, printed a single 3-sentence mention of her departure due to illness, then never again. This is how power buries truth, not with noise, but with curated silence. But let me show you just how deeply engineered her vanishing was. 3 months prior, a letter was sent to the Providence Historical Society, requesting removal of Isabella's portraits from an upcoming exhibit. The signature? Theodore Fairmont, but he later denied ever writing it. 6 weeks prior, her personal bank accounts were quietly drained, funds transferred to an offshore entity with no name, only initials, R.C. And 1 month before she vanished, an unsigned envelope was left at Pembroke's studio. Inside, a lock of Isabella's hair, and a single line. She remembers. That is her crime. But here is where it twists. Pembroke, racked with grief, searched for her. Travelled as far as Lisbon, following dead leads. But in 1891, a journal entry of his was found, unpublished, private, scrawled in desperation. They didn't just take her. They rewrote her. I see her face in paintings where she never sat, hear her name in documents where it doesn't belong. This is not murder. It's narrative manipulation. Imagine that. A woman so powerful, so dangerous to the system. They didn't end her. They unmade her, threaded false versions of her into the world until no one could tell the real from the revision. If they can do that to Isabella Fairmont in 1889, ask yourself, how many others have already been rewritten? And now, if you've made it this far, it's time to choose. Comment this phrase, I will not kneel to forgetting. Write it twice. Once for the world, once for yourself. To lock this in. To mark your transformation. The ones who rewrite the past. There are powers in this world that do not rule from thrones. They rule from archives, from vaults, from sealed collections of names, deeds, letters, some forged, some redacted, some never meant to exist at all. You see, history is not written by the victors. It is edited by the invisible. And Isabella Fairmont, she was redacted, scrubbed from the ledgers, erased from the guest lists. Paintings she sat for replaced with duplicates, same dress, same pose, but a different face, one with no name. But here's what they didn't expect. She left something behind. In 1894, 5 years after her vanishing, a locked box was discovered behind a false panel in the attic of Rosecliffe Manor, sealed with wax, stamped with the Aldridge family crest. Inside, fragments. A letter addressed to My Future Witness. A floor plan marked in blood-red ink, with a single word circled again and again. Remember. And a final page, folded, torn at the edges, written in her own trembling hand. They will come for the story, not to correct it, but to consume it. When you forget me, they win. But if you remember, you break the spell. Isabella knew. She knew what Ravenscroft was built to do, not just protect wealth, but curate perception. To control the collective psyche of a people too distracted by fashion and fortune to notice their own programming. It wasn't just about her. It was about what she represented. A fracture, a defector, a woman of elite breeding who saw the machinery and chose to dismantle it rather than be praised by it. They couldn't let that happen. So they gave her the same fate they've given countless others throughout time. They buried her not in earth, but in false memory. And here's the part you must truly hear. The power of Ravenscroft isn't that they hide the truth. It's that they convince you it was never there, they have just enough behind to make you doubt yourself. A name in a forgotten ledger, a misdated newspaper column, a half-portrait in a museum with no plaque. They don't erase reality. They gaslight history. And now I ask you, how much of what you believe about your world, about your country, your family, yourself, was given to you, not by fact, but by design? Because if they can erase Isabella Fairmont, what makes you think you were ever taught the real past, the Raven Council? Beneath every illusion, there is a hand that crafted it. And behind Isabella Fairmont's disappearance wasn't just a faceless machine, it was a council, real, hidden, generational. They called themselves the Raven Council, not officially, not publicly. But in coded correspondence, in handwritten minutes found decades later in private estate archives, the name repeats, Corvus Ordinem. The Order of the Raven. 9 families. 9 seats. Each representing an ancient line whose wealth predates the American Republic. These were not founders of nations, they were engineers of obedience, bankers, archivists, clergy, industrialists. They didn't seek to rule through visibility. They sought permanence through invisibility. Their role wasn't governance. It was continuity. To preserve the illusion of freedom while quietly maintaining control over the direction of knowledge, commerce, war, and most of all, memory. And here's the part that will haunt you. Every major cultural upheaval of the last 300 years, a reaction to someone getting too close to their archives. The Salem witch trials, a distraction from a land acquisition scandal tied to the original Raven estate. The Lincoln assassination, the removal of a man planning to nationalize banking. Months after private correspondence between his office and a Newport advisory board abruptly ceased. World War I, engineered debt, manufactured crisis, a ritual of sacrifice, sanctioned by signature. Isabella's fall wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was part of a long chain of surgical interventions performed any time someone inside the structure defected. She wasn't punished because she broke the rules. She was eliminated because she threatened to expose the rulebook. And this rulebook? It still exists. We've seen fragments in suppressed memoirs, restricted libraries, whispers buried in the footen, oats of law reviews and historical essays no one reads. A private memo dated 1937 from the estate of J.P. Morgan reads, Council met in Newport. Topic, Containment of symbolic memory breaches. Case study, Fairmont. She was still being discussed, still watched. Long after her body was gone. They don't forget. They archive. And if the Raven Council is real, and every trace points to that cold, harrowing truth, then ask yourself, what other pieces of your past were edited by men you've never seen, in rooms you'll never enter, under rules you were never taught? You're not just remembering Isabella now. You're remembering yourself. The part of you that was trained to forget, the initiation rites of the forgotten, power, true power, never comes without a price. And to sit among the Raven Council, to become one of the hidden architects of history, that price wasn't simply wealth, it wasn't bloodline, it was sacrifice. Rites older than the Constitution, older than the Church. Some whispered to descend from the mystery schools of Alexandria. Others, darker, traced them to pre-Roman rites of memory erasure, practiced in shadowed groves beneath lunar eclipses. The initiation into the council required more than secrecy. It required the destruction of self. You were not allowed to carry your old name, your former allegiances, your attachments. The first rite was known only as the severing, a ritual performed in silence. No audience, no witnesses, only a mirror. You would stand before it and speak aloud everything you had to abandon. A mother's name, a child's laugh, the true memory of a first love. The one moment in your life you swore you would never betray. And then you would recite the oath, "I forget, therefore I rule." The second rite, the gifting. Each new initiate was required to give the council something irreplaceable. Not money, not land, memory, a truth no one else knew, a secret powerful enough to rewrite a narrative, and then voluntarily offer it up to the vault. Isabella's mistake. She refused to forget. They offered her a place. In early 1888, weeks before her disappearance, a sealed envelope had arrived at Rosecliffe. Black wax, raven seal. No return address. Inside, an invitation to join the continuum of stewards. She didn't respond. She investigated. And when she discovered what the rites required, what she would have to surrender, she made the one choice the system couldn't allow. She remembered everything and tried to warn others. That is the one unforgivable sin in the Council's doctrine. Not betrayal, not exposure, but awakening the unaware. Because if too many remember, the illusion collapses, the game ends. And so, she was taken. But not by men in masks or daggers in the dark. No, they took her slowly, with silence, with social exclusion, with legal falsification, with removal from narrative memory. That's how these rites echo through time. They're still happening, now. Not in ancient halls, but in digital spaces, in education, in media, in the curated forgetting of modern man. Think about it. What have you already given up, just to belong? Her final rebellion. When a system this vast, this ancient, targets you for erasure, there are only two ways out: obedience or inscription. Isabella Fairmont chose the latter. She knew the Raven Council would come for her, not with violence, but with revision. They would take her identity, her presence, her echo, and overwrite her with silence. So she did the unthinkable. She wrote herself into places they couldn't reach. Not in headlines, not in ledgers, but in symbols, in architecture, in the geometry of her own manner. The final weeks of her life were not lived in fear, but in code. She left behind messages, not for the authorities, for you. In the north-facing stained glass of the Rosecliffe greenhouse, the blue segments form a raven in flight, head turned backward. A symbol from old Celtic myth, the backward raven sees what was stolen. In the floor tiles of her private study, the pattern deviates slightly. 13 black stones form a spiral. A mathematician later discovered the alignment corresponds to lunar cycles and the Hebrew numerological value for remnant, but it was her final act that defied them most. Pembroke, who returned to Newport in secret years later, found a hidden drawer in Isabella's escritoire. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, a silver locket with no photograph, only a mirrored surface. A page torn from her diary, the ink smudged by tears, or rain, or both, and a cipher. 23 characters, scrawled like a last breath. The story you remember is not the one that happened. The truth lies in the fracture. The fracture. That word, fracture, appears in no other surviving Fairmont documents, but it shows up, curiously, in 3 other places. A redacted Navy log dated 1890, referencing a secret holding off the Rhode Island coast, codenamed The Fracture. A personal letter from Vice President Levi Morton, burned except for the closing line, "The fracture remains contained. Fairmont is no longer a threat." And finally, chiseled beneath the altar of a decommissioned Newport chapel, now closed to the public. Through the fracture, the sleepers wake. That was her final message. Isabella wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to leave breadcrumbs. For us. For those who might one day question the story we were told. You see, erasure is only permanent if no one remembers. But now you do. And once a single soul carries a forbidden truth, the silence begins to crack. The digital resurrection of the Raven system, you thought this was just history? No, this was prototype. The Raven Council never died. They adapted. As revolutions burned monarchies and machines replaced thrones, the Council didn't resist. They evolved, shifted from marble estates and secret ledgers to servers, algorithms, and data vaults. The manipulation that once required whispers in candle-lit libraries now happens at the speed of a keystroke. And the doctrine has not changed. It's simply upgraded. Oblivione regnare, to rule by forgetting. But now you participate in it. Every scroll, every click, every piece of information you trust, without questioning where it came from. That's the new ritual. You don't need chains if the prisoner has no memory of freedom. Look around you. Modern fact-checking agencies founded by billionaires with undisclosed boards. Educational curriculums rewritten every decade to favor compliance over cognition. Media algorithms that filter not just what you see, but what you forget. You think that's coincidence? No. It's the Raven system reborn. This time, not in old Newport mansions, but in your feed. They learned their lesson with Isabella. They saw how one awakened voice, one woman with the will to remember, could shatter centuries of silence. So now they don't erase after the rebellion. They erase before it begins. Preemptive memory management. Historical compression. Written articles that overwrite conflicting narratives with updated consensus. Online archives purged, edited, flagged for inaccuracy. Your own memories reshaped by repetition and distraction until even you can't tell what's real. And here's the final horror. You were trained to want this, to crave the convenience of forgetting, to distrust anything that feels too deep, too strange, too unapproved. But now you know. You've heard her name. You've followed the trail, and that makes you a problem. Because truth, dangerous truth, is not viral. It's contagious. And once it enters your system, your worldview can never return to its sanitized state. That's why the Council still watches. Not with swords, with silence, with signal. You see, they don't need to stop you from speaking. They only need to convince you that no one else remembers. But now you do. And now you must ask, what part of your own story was edited before you ever got the chance to live it? The Unforgivable Act. Remembering. This is the part where most turn back. Not because they're weak, but because they finally see how deep the fracture runs. And the truth? It's terrifying. Because once you see it, once you remember, you can't unknow. You can't unsee the edits. You can't re-enter the illusion. But that's the point. Isabella Fairmont wasn't destroyed because she broke the rules. She was destroyed because she refused to forget them. She remembered the structure, the faces, the oaths, the mirror room, the garden beneath the garden. And then she remembered herself. And in doing so, she committed the one act this world's shadow architects will never forgive. She chose to awaken before they gave her permission. Understand this. Her vanishing was never about morality. It was about control, about preventing you from doing exactly what you're doing now. Remembering. Because memory is identity. And the moment you claim it for yourself, not as history, but as blood-deep recognition, you step outside the system. You leave the map. You become what they fear most, a soul that cannot be rewritten. That is the fracture. That is the weapon. That is the reason they built entire empires of forgetting. And now the fracture is inside you. Right now, in this moment, there is a choice to be made, and this time, you're not being asked politely. You're being summoned. Not to believe, to remember. Because if you're hearing this, truly hearing it, then somewhere, something ancient in you is waking up. A memory buried not in your mind, but in your blood. They want you numb, scattered, distracted. But you followed the trail. You felt the weight of the silences, and now you know. She didn't vanish. She became legend in exile. A warning, a mirror, a question whispered through time. Will you kneel to forgetting, or fracture the silence? If this truth found a home in you, comment it again. I will not kneel to forgetting. I will not kneel to forgetting. Once for the algorithm, once for your future self. Because now, you carry the fracture. And that means the silence is ending. Now go. Speak her name. Break their spell. Isabella Fairmont. 89. Never erased. Only hidden. And now, remembered.